I'm sitting in the gorgeous Sarah P. Duke Gardens in Durham, North Carolina on a beautiful spring day. And we're going to be talking today about a fascinating subject called Afrobotany, which is a branch of ethnobotany. And I'm here with the expert, Marc Williams. And Marc, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And for me and our viewers, please define this topic.
Well, I'm very glad to be joining you, Marty, as an expert, because there are certainly more. And I realized too that ethnobotany in and of itself is maybe a little bit esoteric. So you can kind of break it down as two words, ethno being the study of, say, ethnic groups, different cultural groups around the world, and then botany, of course, the study of plants. And so ethnobotany combines those studies of how people in different places have traditions with plants for food, for medicine, for craft, for ritual. And then, of course, Afrobotany being a subset of that, basically characterizing the African American experience and the diaspora experience with the plants that they have traditions with.
Wow, fascinating. And being in America with such a rich African American tradition here, I'm intrigued to hear how that intersects.
Yeah, well, in so many ways, as you might imagine, over centuries of time. And of course, that story starts in Africa. And then through that diaspora, through the tragedy, I must say, of enslavement.
Yes.
And the plantation system and economy, and how African Americans in these very ingenious ways have been able to sustain themselves over those centuries of time, often bringing lots of knowledge from their places of origin, and of course at times also combining that knowledge with the indigenous peoples of the lands here.
The American Indians and their rich knowledge of what was growing and how to use it.
Exactly, because of course some plants have been brought here from other places, whether that be Africa, like black-eyed peas, watermelon,
peanuts,
lots of amazing plants that have been brought here, certainly from Europe as well. Especially a lot of the plants that just now kind of grow freely across the landscape, but have a rich herbal tradition there. And then, of course, so many, well over 20,000 native plants to North America too. And so ultimately coming up with this synthesis, right, of the uses of plants, the ways of thinking about looking at ailments, and then the different plants and what roles they might have to play.
It's intriguing to me that people who were brought here against their will were able to bring anything with them. I mean, and it's amazing to me. One of the descriptions in doing research for this piece, I was reading on in one book, people were talking about how African Americans brought here against their will. There were crops that they were forced to grow, and then crops that they grew willingly for themselves. And many of those were these African origin that they somehow managed to bring with them, and that have now become integrated so richly into our own American cuisine and medicine and all of that. It's really a fascinating story.
Yes, for instance, oftentimes, in particular with the crop of rice, I think a lot of folks in the mainstream public might associate that with an Asian extract, right? But certainly rice traditions in Africa. And yes, one example that's been documented is the literal braiding of grains of rice into the hair of people that were on this perilous journey so that they could have a piece of home, and obviously one of the most important foodstuffs possible to be able to proceed forth.
Wow.
And Soulfire Farm, I think of as an amazing educational institution in New York, and they have an incredible book, Farming While Black, that talks about that story. But certainly rice and indigo being some of the major crops, in particular out on the coast and in South Carolina initially.
Yeah, but pre-revolutionary indigo was a huge industry, and that came from Africa. How about that?
So, of course, here we are in the Tar Heel state, famed for the naval stores industry, and that's something that goes back to Elizabethan times. That was one of the main needs of the ships from the English and all the other European powers. And so way antebellum, freedom, most of that industry is something run by African American people, whether it's the cutting into the pines to make the boxes or to generate the sap that would be collected in order to make things like turpentine and rosin and
pitch.
Tar, the tar of the Tar Heel.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Wow, I did not know that. And even using them to weave in basketry and
Certainly
such.
basketry up to this day is actually something that in particular kind of brings in this idea of non-timber forest products where you will basically have the tree standing but figure out what you can do with the things that are in the forest in the meantime.
Yeah, in our state, in Tennessee, of course, especially West Tennessee, had some massive plantations there because the soil was good for cotton. And but what you see there are, you know, the total influence of so much cuisine that's been African influence. Okra, for example, a staple.
Definitely.
And a lot of people, I mean, many people don't realize that Africa is where these things that they think of as quintessentially Southern food stuffs are actually African in origin.
For sure. A good friend of mine, Chris Smith, has written a book called The Whole Okra that really explores the fascinating history of that one crop. But you don't get much more Tennessean or Appalachian than something like the tradition of whiskey.
Sure.
And of all the whiskeys, certainly one of the most famous is Jack Daniel's that everybody pretty much knows, even if they drink or not.
Lynchburg, Tennessee.
Right. And lots of people, though, don't necessarily know the story of Nathan Nearest Green, who is one of the people to instruct Jack Daniels in the art of distillation, who was an enslaved person.
Really?
Yeah.
So Jack Daniels owes Jack Daniels to...
Yeah, Nathan Nearest Green. Yeah, and now there is a Nathan Nearest Green whiskey company as well.
Well, good.
So that's good, and his name's getting further out there. But also, just like country music, right? Nashville, so many of the roots of country, I mean, the banjo is from Africa, right?
African instrument.
Which a lot of people just think of as like quintessential Appalachia, and when they think of Appalachia, they typically think of Anglo-Saxon folks, and yet very rich tradition of African Americans in country music, in bluegrass. And,
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So in terms of our, you know, gardening and things like this, I mean, what are there specific plants that come to mind that we utilize that have this African connection that maybe people aren't aware of? I mean, aside from foodstuffs, in terms of maybe decorative or you know, horticultural interest.
So certainly a plant that a lot of people will recognize, from the red of red zinger tea to lots of other products, is the sorrel, also known as hibiscus, sapdorifa being the scientific name, jamaica. For folks of the Latine community that makes these beautiful ruby red beverages.
Yeah.
And at the same time is an incredible ornamental in the garden due to the red calyces that are outside of the bloom that is what goes into those beverages, and certainly a medicinal tradition as well. And this is all another plant that comes from Africa.
There you go. I know there are quite a few house plants, tropical plants that are African in origin, dracaenas.
Yeah.
And what they tragically call dumb cane, Dieffenbachia, is African in origin. And these are plants that everybody grows pretty much. I mean, if they keep house plants, you've got a dracaena. I mean,
yeah, and it's interesting because I think Africa can often also get conflated almost as one place, right? Versus this huge continent, much bigger than North America. And most of the African Americans here are coming more from the West Coast, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Ghana.
Right.
A lot of the ornamentals, though, coming way further down south in South Africa.
Right.
And also, though, foodstuffs that are kind of more popular all the more all the time, like rooibos tea, for instance, is one that comes from South Africa. Also the pelargonium geraniums that people will often recognize in their garden, but also has a very rich tradition of medicinal herbal use.
Right, that's quite true. I mean, both the ornamental, what we call horticultural geraniums, zonal geraniums, those are South African, as are ivy geraniums, as are all the scented geraniums, like rose and lemon and all of that. And you're right, so many bulbs are from South Africa. I'm looking at some right now, Ifian, those little light blue guys. Those are South African. Yeah, really, it's all so beautiful. And people don't realize how rich that has given us, all the rich horticultural traditions. That's really a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I'm so happy that people are now starting to recognize this. You know, there's a colonial mindset that sort of put that down for a long time, and I'm happy that it's being overcome. It's a wonderful thing.
Likewise, and in familiar figures of history that people will realize, like Harriet Tubman and her rescuing people from enslavement to freedom, might not necessarily connect the dots of what kind of skill set, what kind of intellectual property that would take. So very much a famed herbalist, as you could imagine, in order to be able to keep people well through such a traumatic and challenging journey.
Right, but she knew herbal medicine and was able to help people in their travails with their health in these terrible settings.
For centuries, there is this tradition in the African American community of the granny midwife, and this would be delivering babies both of black and white folks, and would certainly take a embodied herbal knowledge to be able to practice that safely, let alone then to continue the life in a healthy way of the people formerly on the plantation, but certainly even for poor folks, once again, black and white, into Jim Crow times, that needed that healing, that intellectual property, I'll say, that didn't have access to a hospital.
Or formal doctoring.
Or formal doctors necessarily, and certainly something that transitioned with the coming up of the American Medical Association in the early 1900s, but persisted up until living memory and is documented very well by many of these midwives themselves and other scholarly literature. I think of a book by Duke Press, actually, about the herbal traditions of the South that features the healer Emma Dupree, for instance, and her incredible journey. I think of an enslaved person named Caesar that in 1750 was granted his freedom because of antidote to poison remedy, and then given a pension, if you can imagine, way back then. How
in 1750.
Exactly, way pre, the end of enslavement. And so, these people are there kind of, I think, to some degree, waiting in the wings to be given their flowers, to be illuminated and recognized for everything that they've built into this country to make it as incredible as it is in a lot of ways.
Well, it's certainly deeply woven into the fabric of everything we do, and as gardeners, everything, so much of what we do, working with knowledge of the earth and of plants and all of that deep connectedness to what's vital on this planet, in my opinion. So.
Very much so, and I can definitely also just speak from my own personal lived experience, being the son of a black man born in Alabama in 1938, that certainly just by default had this embedded wisdom around what to grow in your garden, and certainly some of these remedies that wasn't necessarily passed on to me, I think in large part because of this idea of superseding that, like escaping the need for that, or how challenging the history behind it. And yet I'm so happy to say that there are so many people now living in this day and age right outside of Nashville and Clarksville. I think of my dear friend Sabande Greer and her Natural Choices Botanica and Sacred Waters healing retreats that she does to educate folks from the African American community in these ways in a contemporary context. And so many more, like Stephanie Rose Bird and Lucretia Van Dyke and on and on. So many books that are coming out now to illuminate these types of traditions.
A lot of scholarship being done in this area, and it's so illuminating, like you say, and so interesting, and it really enriches our understanding of our own culture.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
I mean,
so a lot of people will recognize this up and coming, although it's been their long tradition of having a bottle tree in the garden, and especially glass that is blue, and not necessarily know the connection that that's something that comes out of Africa.
I didn't know it.
And yeah, it's certainly pretty to look at, but also serves a function in the folk tradition of African Americans, basically with blue as a color that is used to capture bad spirits. And something that you also hear in the term haint blue, the painting, especially in the Low Country, over porches that would also keep bad spirits away.
Wow.
And yeah, that's something that obviously is another African American tradition that lives on today.
It's all over Tennessee. Super popular bottle trees with blue, cobalt blue glass.
Exactly. This all is rooted in some of these incredible traditions like hoodoo, mojo working. People maybe know mojo from blues music, but not necessarily understand the herbal basis of that. Root workers would be another term, a bunch of different ways to frame this knowledge and wisdom of nature and how to work with the elements and various different plants to bring good fortune, to bring good love, obviously health and well-being, and all of it.
I just love how connected up everything is. It's music, it's gardening, it's you know, I mean, a kind of a subcultural thing and a wider cultural thing. It's just delightful to me to learn all these connections that I didn't know about.
Right. I mean, as far as music goes as well, there's this kind of legendary spiritual song, Follow the Drinking Gourd, that is often
classic.
Classic and taught in schools, kind of pairing together this wisdom of looking at the Big Dipper and knowing that that's north, and then the orientation of the land around to figure out how to get yourself to freedom. I would say, just as a qualifier, being an academic, that it's a bit questionable how deeply rooted that is into the tradition back to enslavement, but it's certainly a great metaphor either way of the knowledge that it would take and how you can transmit that knowledge in cultural ways through song.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that I think is probably really germane here is these people are brought here, but they have this tradition of deep, insightful observation of their surroundings. And even though they're in a strange country with location wasn't a country yet, but with strange plants, they could start to observe and understand and then utilize our American plants as well.
And then embed that wisdom into their naming practices too.
Yes.
Because oftentimes I think there's this false dichotomy between scientific terminology and folk wisdom and names, and yet often embedded within folk names are something that's going to tell you about the potential application of the plant for food, for medicine.
Sure. Like bone set. There's a plant called bone set.
Exactly.
We grow it in our gardens, but that's not what it started for in human usage.
Yeah, and very much in the African American tradition, that one, as well as so many others.
Well, Marc, I just want to say thank you so much. This has just been a delight for me. And it's so illuminating, and I really appreciate you spending your time and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us.
It is so my pleasure to bring light to this subject and to lift it up as much as possible.
Oh, that's lovely.
For inspiring garden tours, growing tips, and garden projects, visit our website at volunteergardener.org or on YouTube at the Volunteer Gardener channel, and like us on Facebook.